and I'm going to go live. So hang on, folks, while we get this puppy in gear. Alex, did you get a good night's sleep last night?
I did.
Good. All right, you're on Lunch Conversations with Randy and Teddy. And for those that don't know, I'm Teddy. Our special guest today is Edwin Alex Floate. We'll introduce him to you a little bit more in a minute. But before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors. Lunch Conversations with Randy and Teddy is in part sponsored by the Elder Law Firm. They want to help you keep your commitments to your loved ones, those who need help with estate planning or elder care planning. So reach out to the Elder Law Firm in Greensboro, North Carolina. The number is 336-396-4551. And Randy, what do they need to tell the Elder Law Firm?
They need to say that Randy sent them. And if they don't, I don't know what the penalty is, but hopefully they will.
or the benefits. So
a lot of good benefits.
You doing all right today, man?
Yeah. You know, I just double checked and it looks like we're in business as far as LinkedIn and Facebook.
Look,
so
dude,
we're good to go.
Dude, I got this thing down, man. Show what is it? Show 118, 117? You would think I figured it out by now.
Actually, I think this will be number 120. We're you know what, Alex, we started this thing back when COVID hit. So we can trace our roots back to when everybody got sent home. So you're talking April of 2020 thereabout, and they haven't shut this thing down yet. So we'll keep on doing it. As long as Teddy pays me these exorbitant wages, I'll continue to spend time with him. So, hey, before we dive in, Randy Wooden with Goodwill Industries, Northwest North Carolina, director for our professional center here based in Winston. We help professionals with their job search. And as always, everything is free. We don't charge you, but we do ask that you reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn. And golly, I write a column in the paper. I do stuff on radio and TV and a whole host of other places to kind of get the word out. But get together with Teddy a couple times a week, share some tips, ideas, stories, job hunt tips, and all kinds of things. And this is the first, I think, in the history of Lunch with Randy and Teddy, a futurist we'll have today. So let me turn it back to you, Teddy, and get this thing started.
Cool. So good seeing you again, buddy.
Yeah, man.
For those who've never met me or heard what I do, I'm a LinkedIn strategist. I'm also a Google Workspace strategist, teaching those two platforms as business tools to business professionals. Love doing one-on-one classes and seminars and workshops and public speaking. Every now and then I'll put my sandwich board on and stand in the middle of the street and tell people what they should be doing using those tools, but not so often. But yeah, we get together every Wednesday and we bring a special guest, and our job, and by the way, I need your help. Randy and I need your help to do this because, you know, if we don't have your ideas, we're going to go always with our ideas. Unfortunately, and it's show 119, dude, I just checked.
Is 119?
For 119 times, we have brought great people to these conversations. We need your ideas. If you know an absolutely phenomenal topic, a phenomenal speaker, you have to introduce Randy and I to the speaker so we can have a conversation about them, so we can bring your ideas to the show. So that's my ask for anybody who's listening to us right now. And today, Edwin Alex Floate is with us. He is a futurist. By the way, thank you, Cindy Martin, for introducing Alex to us. And Dr. Floate is a consulting futurist, which means he wants to help individuals and organizations whose goal is to implement strategic, listen to this word, foresight, based on real information and real trends that can be ascertained through good research. And Alex, to help me out, I'm way past myself. Introduce yourself to our audience, please.
Well, I am Alex Floate. I drop the first name and go by my middle name normally. So you can call me Alex, or if you're referencing me in the comments, Alex.
Yeah.
And I am a futurist. It's a field that I came to have interest in when I first read about it in the early 90s. This is even the pre-internet days. And up till that point, I'd studied a lot of history and political science, and that's all great subjects. But then I thought, well, that's what's happened. And I read about these professional futurists who look at what could happen. And it's been interesting me ever since, but life took me a different course until about 5 years ago when I decided I want to learn more about this. So I looked around and found there's 3 programs that offer advanced degrees in the United States at that time. And there's University of Hawaii, University of Houston, and Regent University out of Virginia Beach, where I went for a doctorate in strategic leadership with a concentration in foresight.
Yeah.
And ever since then, I've been working in this field.
Yeah. Cool. And you are a Marine.
I am, yes.
Yeah.
Once a Marine, always a Marine.
And if I heard right, you have family who's also in the Marines.
My son was in the Marines. He spent 4 years there.
Yeah.
And he got out, and he's now back in what they call the Treasure Valley in Boise, looking at starting a business and finishing a business degree there.
Yeah. Real cool. So
hey, just jump in real quick. If you have a comment or a question for Alex, put that in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on the chat box. You've kind of addressed the why question already, I think, Alex. If there's anything else you want to add, was there a single moment where you said, yep, this is the role for me? Was there a single moment or a driving force at some point that really, really pointed you in the direction you are now?
I think it just came from as I grew older. So this interest was first stimulated as I was finishing a bachelor's degree in social sciences. And at that time, I had family to take care of, had the first child on the way, and I said, I can't go back to school at this point for a master's in foresight, because the article was actually about the University of Houston offering a master's in foresight, about 1994 or so. But as you age, as you get experience, as you work in the corporate world, and you begin to see how things transpire, both in our political, in our nation's future, and the way the nation is moving itself.
Yeah.
And then you get a chance to work in a few businesses where you see how decisions are made about the future in businesses. You begin to see that a lot of times we're not necessarily making these decisions about the future with a strong basis of understanding the future. We spend a lot of time in our society focusing on history. So history is one of those things, but we don't have any studies necessarily, at least not until the last 50 years, that focus on the future. And that's what strategic foresight does, is it takes some methodologies that began with the US government back in the 50s, when they were trying to understand what are the scenarios, especially around war with Russia at that time, that superpower struggle.
Yeah.
And people began to then take some of the methodologies that they were building at that time and move them into the private sphere. And that's how we ended up with strategic foresight and this building of ways of thinking, of methodologies, of working through issues, and of understanding even about the future, about the fact that everything that we do and don't do today contributes to possible futures that we are going to live. So, and that's what makes the future so hard to, you can't predict it. So future studies, strategic foresight is just, how can we give it our best understanding of where the future might go?
Yeah. So when I first started hearing the term futurist, and I had a really narrow, screwed up perspective of what it was. And as you and I talked earlier before the show, I had what I think we refer to as preppers and futurists confused in my mind. And you helped me determine that I had a misconception. So to go a little deeper, Alex, define what is a futurist and what is a futurist not?
So a futurist is someone who does use methodologies of strategic foresight. And these are even becoming a little more common and codified even somewhat in both the literature as well as in the academic sense. And we use, as you mentioned earlier, you're looking, definitely trends analysis is looking at it, but you're also looking at understanding just systems. How systems work is a very big part, because if you can understand how systems work, then you can begin to understand how adjustments in the systems or shocks to the system will play out. And you also need to understand as a futurist that there is no data about the future. So it's not about crunching numbers. You can definitely extrapolate data into the future, but having worked in finance, anything beyond 5 years is basically just garbage anyway. And just, you know, trying to come up with that data and stuff there. About the only data futurists can really reliably use for the most part is demographic data.
Because that's
just simply because if you have 120-year-olds today, you're going to have 130-year-olds minus what you normally expect. You know, wild card events could change that greatly, but demographics are about the one stable data you have. What foresight is not is prediction. Anybody who tells you that they can predict the future is a charlatan, because the future is so vast, so unknowable, that no one person could predict it. And in fact, futurists, there's one line of thinking that foresight is a team sport. And almost all futurists acknowledge that you really need to bring in much broader perspectives than any one person. So as a futurist, it's not that I am talking about, it's not what I'm going to tell you what the future is like. What I will do is go into an organization and help them find those possible futures. I come with the set of tools, the broad understanding of systems, of history, of economics, of political science, and even understanding psychology of people. I can come in and provide that ability to work through with an organization to help them see what their possible futures are. A lot of times that information is in the organization. You just need somebody to help tease it out.
So Randy, did you hear what Alex said about me?
Yeah.
Did you hear what he said?
Yeah. You got your crystal ball there, Teddy. I thought you could tell the future.
I mean, come on, man. You're busting my entire persona here, Alex. No, I'm with you, man.
Okay.
Hey, Alex,
I didn't invalidate the other 118 episodes.
It's a very tiny crystal ball, so it only sees like a day or two into the future. But so I guess I'm not going to pick up next week's winning lottery tickets from you. After all, I guess that's not going to happen. I got to ask you this, and if we don't want to do it right now, I want to work it in later at some point. Yeah. Sounds like you have to sift through a ton of information. You have to read a lot. You get intel from various sources. And because it's not a look back necessarily on what you're not trying to project what happened. You already know what happened. How do you sift through what I'll call the noise out there, all the different sources, and try to winnow that down to, okay, these are more reliable sources of info. These are more well-known. And how do you determine where you're going to select your info that helps you to reach a conclusion, or to reach whatever you want to call it, if not a conclusion? You got to have a lot of intel coming in from a lot of different places.
Yeah, excellent question, because a lot of information, and this is one of the things of modern society, is we're getting bombarded with so much information that filtering is going to become one of the next waves of possibilities for people, how you filter. But unfortunately, when you're filtering, that means that you're also saying no to certain information. As a futurist, I try to we call it scanning. So you're scanning the horizon for what may be coming that way. And a lot of times that scanning will happen on the fringes, or it'll be somebody working somewhere has started something, and then you're trying to determine that. I read about one futurist who was understanding that smartphones were going, or where the technology was going, because she was in Japan, and someone had hacked their cell phone to interface with the internet. And this is in like 1996, 1997. So they, very much before internet's just really starting, mobile phones are really still on the way, but this person had hacked his phone to be able to get to the internet. So he's on the street trying to give her directions. So she's like, oh, well, and then what happened? About 10 years later, you have Apple and it's coming out. So sometimes you're looking at those fringes. You're looking at the start of either sometimes social trends or technological trends or political trends. And then you move from that. What you generally do is, if you're in an organization and they're saying, look, we need to understand where the future is going to go because this is our product line, then you might direct your scanning a little more into that area that they're going to be looking at. But as a futurist, though, I try to scan broadly. I go out, I try to find sometimes newsletters or podcasts that are, on that fringe that talk about things, and just try to take in a little bit of everything just so I can understand and be a little more informed when something does pop up.
Yeah, I'm with you. And so I just heard you say that Randy and I are on the fringe of this great podcast that we're going to influence what people think about the future. And in my head, Alex, I heard that.
Yeah, go with that, Teddy.
He gets a lot of voices talk to his head, so he's got to sift through those too, just like you do. But he's got some real.
Let's talk about skills, Alex. Let's talk about skills, because I mean, there's lots of tools, but there's also lots of skills to make a futurist successful, to come up with the information that is needed for us to make good decisions. Talk a little bit about what skills does a futurist have in context of strategic foresight.
Well, and the Association of Professional Futurists have actually put out, it's kind of a draft at this point that's been out there for a few years of looking at that, of saying what are the skills. And there are a number of them that go beyond what you might normally think as far as a skill needed. But realistically, also, when you look at them, it's what any high-level performer in an organization will need. And that's people skills, so that you can work with groups, work with teams. You need to work through people to help get those pictures of the future. And then also you're going to have specific knowledge. So if you're working in technology, or you're working in medical science, or you're working in politics, you're going to need a lot of that information as well. Then there's also systems. Systems thinking is something that's really come on in the last 20 to 30 years. It kind of picked up in the 60s when it was, once again, when it started to be kind of codified and brought into academia. And systems thinking is very much something a person needs to understand. If you don't understand how the system works to begin with, you're not going to understand how that system is going to drive its own future, or how the inputs can be manipulated by events in order to. And I know I'm repeating myself from earlier, but that's because systems thinking is so important to understanding that. And then just some of the methodologies of how to tease out, of how to do scenario planning, for example. Scenario planning is kind of the gold standard of techniques, but there's quite a bit to it. And it has a history, once again, about 50 or 60 years, starting with Pierre Wack when he took it into the mainstream corporate world and Shell. And then we've seen it go down to where even Oxford teaches a program on scenario planning, which I ended up taking here during the pandemic. Pandemic ruined my trip to England to go to Oxford, but we ended up doing it online. And so they've actually brought that into academia, and they teach scenario planning as well. Yeah,
we'll talk a little bit more about that later on as well. So Randy?
Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, it sounds like you got to take a real deep dive into a whole heap and helping of information. So does that help from your standpoint to specialize in technology or healthcare? so that you're somewhat of an expert. And when you consult, you're consulting within that industry primarily, or are you more of a generalist that just says, hey, you know, you're going to write the check, I'll go, you know, I'll learn it and I'll help you.
Yeah. For myself,
yeah,
I tend to be a generalist,
okay,
but I can also be a quick study. And one of the skills, like I said, is when you're talking about teams and people, is understanding where to get that knowledge or who to ask and who to go to. And then especially when you walk into an organization, it's beginning to understand who the people are in that organization that have the information about the future, and they may not know it. So then you can tease it out of them and see what their perspectives are. And they'll have the information because it's what they do. So I don't spend all my time, say, on technology. And technology is a very important driver of change. Sometimes it seems like it's the only driver. But then you have to look at all the other things. You have to look at the social, the political, the human elements, the economic, and all those things and how they play into those changes. And they'll play in, even if you're talking about technology itself and what that technology can do, it's still, you have to look at all these other things to understand, will that technology flourish or will it be bypassed by something else because there's not large adoption of it. It's too expensive. It's not going to be, you know, there's ideological differences between the technology and the people that would be using it. So there are quite a few things, but you can generally find the specialists that have the knowledge on the subject. And then in my case, I'm the futurist who wants to help them realize that and bring that out. That's where we use the different methodologies and the different, because that's where foresight becomes a mindset also, and a way of thinking. And since we don't necessarily teach it, a lot of people don't think about it and don't, you know, think about how to think about the future.
Look what I just heard you say, Alex, and that is that, and I get it, technology is one of the big drivers of change, and we have to pay attention to here's my words. I think we have to pay attention to what we are expecting and then creating with technology. I mean, somebody just doesn't go, hey, I created this thing right here, and you know, I think this is going to have a big impact on people's lives. This thing here was created because people wanted it, you know, and so that's I think one of the big things I can imagine would be important as a futurist is to be listening to society wherever you can, and probably easier today to listen to it with all the content through the interwebs, but to listen to what people are looking for. I mean, listen to what they are talking about. Maybe, Alex, help me with this one, maybe listen to what they're not as afraid of. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so listen to what they're not afraid of versus what they are. And actually, yeah, so that's where it goes back to where I was talking about. Technology is often a driver of change in society, but it's really truly whether people adopt it, what their views on it are, what their needs are, and what it goes back to. Will it solve problems for them? And sometimes we don't realize just how handy or what problems we might have until we're actually shown what problems we might have. And even then, and I'll tell you what, it's also a matter of sometimes technology or things that we introduce they'll fit those needs, but like I said, I think I'm kind of losing my thoughts here on it. I'm kind of with the iPhone, for example, which I believe is what you held up, because I think you're an Apple kind of guy, and you know, that showed us a possibility of what things we could do.
Yeah.
But I think what's important to understand is the iPhone was not the first smartphone. And that's what a lot of people think. People think Apple invented the iPhone or the smartphone.
Smartphone, yeah.
But there was actually some Japanese companies that had actually introduced similar products in Japan in 2002, 2003. But what you have there is you have that nexus of a marketing organization that brings something to fruition, and even if the technology itself is not necessarily brand new, the way it's presented, the way it's promoted, and things like that, then that's where it brings it to the general public. And all of a sudden you have people adopting it.
And Todd dropped in the chat that Steve Jobs created the iPhone because he could, and he knew it was possible. But Todd, I think I heard an interview with Steve Jobs years ago that he said he created it because he knew people wanted that information in their hand. He knew that people wanted, all the stuff that he could do, a calculator, a phone. It was an interesting conversation. And I wager he probably had to some degree, another futurist help him, because this brainchild wasn't just from his own, it was from his tribe that they came up with this idea. And he goes, and I'm going to make it. Yeah. Randy?
Well, a couple things, and we may not be able to, I know we take a break at a half past the hour. One of our folks has asked, how much belief do we put in the input from a futurist? How do we vet them? Maybe is another way to look at it. How do we know that your intel is different or better than the next guy? And something else I'd like to dive into in the second half, and that would be put some meat on the bones to the degree that you can here. Give us an example of a project you worked on, and what are some of the processes, the questions that you ask? What is the give and take, the feedback with your client and their pushback? And they say, okay, well, what if it doesn't work? What's plan B? And just kind of walk us through what your a day in the life is for you. But first, can we believe you? We had somebody ask, how do we know that the futurist is somebody we can take stock in and believe?
Well, first of all, you shouldn't really believe anything a futurist says.
Okay.
and I say
go back to my crystal ball, Randy, is what I just heard him say.
I need a crystal ball of my own. I had a chapstick. It's not. Never mind.
It's just simply because the future is unknown.
Yeah.
And futurists can look at things, and what we can do is we can provide visions of possible futures, things that may happen. We can look and say, well, these things are possible. These things are probably a little more probable. And then, but we also want we want to tease out what's the preferable future. And the preferable future is different. There's about 7 billion preferable futures out there floating around the world right now, because everyone has their own idea of what a preferable future is, and it can change depending on the subject.
Yeah.
So it's especially interesting when you start getting into community and what the preferable futures are for communities as well. But realistically, a futurist does not have necessarily the best view of the future. We are just a lot more aware of how expansive it is and all the various things that go into making that future. But what we do is we bring that knowledge and education that we have to help people understand what their own visions of the future are, and to help them decide what those preferable futures are. And then we use foresight to lay out what these visions are and where they might go. And then the next step is to take those visions of the future and start putting them into something of a strategic plan. So you could start watching for, if that vision starts to come true, or certain elements you start to see it come true, then you've already thought about it, and you can definitely use it to inform your strategy and your responses. And I've got a few stories about the other futurists and how those really worked out.
And we'll talk about those in a few minutes, because you and I did talk about some of those examples. Some of them really interesting. Some of them like, oh my God, how'd they miss that? And some of them being, wow, I didn't see that coming at all. And before I do the 30-minute break ad spot, Dean is, I know what Dean's looking for. Dean's looking for the transporter because he asked a question about Star Trek inspiring technology. And I know Dean wants to hop around the world through a transporter. But before we do that, you're on Lunch Conversations with Randy and Teddy. And our special guest today is Dr. Edwin Alex Floate. The conversations about futurists and about strategic foresight. And Lunch Conversations with Randy and Teddy is sponsored by the Elder Law Firm out of Greensboro, North Carolina. I love this statement. You hear me say it every week. Who's important to you and how you plan to honor your responsibilities for them is also important to the Elder Law Firm. So reach out to them for elder care matters. Reach out to them for estate planning matters. Reach out to them to put all those documents together that you need so that you can protect yourself and your finances in the future. I can tell you right now, as a futurist, if you don't do that right now, it won't work for you then. How's that, Alex? Call the Elder Law Firm at 336-396-4551 and remind them that Randy told you to call. So, yeah.
Hey, make sure if you've got a comment or question for Alex, put that in the chat area. We'll try to work those in. So we're learning about what it is to be a futurist. Can we dive into? I'd love to be able just to understand kind of the process. Can you give us a case study, something that you did without divulging anything proprietary? That would be awesome.
Well, so one thing is going into a community, and you go into a community and you bring the leaders together of that community. And this is a project I actually did in my hometown a few years ago, where you're just bringing together business and people from the nonprofit, the education sector, and you're bringing together some local political leaders, and then you get them all in one room. And what you do is you start walking them through some of the different exercises that we do, and there's a number of different things. You can start by just taking one topic and saying, all right, so we would like to think about, say, healthcare. Mm-hmm. And then you can choose an aspect of that. And you can say, well, what are three things that could happen to healthcare that are good, and what are three things that could happen that would be negative to it? So, and then you can start putting those down. And once again, these are just kind of thinking exercises, start opening you up to thinking about the future. And then you go to that next level on each of those six things, and you start building it out more and say, well, what about if this was to happen? So something positive, say universal healthcare. Something like that. That's in my mind is a positive, and most people's is. And if universal healthcare comes in, though, what are two positives and maybe two negatives of that? Mm-hmm. Because everybody having healthcare, I think, is a positive step. But there's going to be things that are not going to be positive for everyone. Yeah. And then when you start thinking about both sides of a coin, and you're forced to think about those things, and you're thinking about it for around this subject, you start to begin to see how things could change in the future depending on how different pathways go. Yeah. And that's one way you can do it. There's a lot of different methodologies. Some of them are a little more involved, where you take and one of the preferable ones that I like to use is you actually look at the history of what you're going to be looking at. So when you're looking at a community, we looked at the history of that community and how it developed over the years. Mm-hmm. Now, from that, we say, okay, well, what is the likelihood of that history continuing, and for the community to continue to develop in that way? And what are the possibilities of it if it doesn't? And so those are some general methods where you begin to look at it, and you begin to move into things, and you have to discuss issues that affect that community. And a lot of it will come down to what is the subject matter that you're actually looking at. And a community is different than maybe what a business looks like. A business might want to know, hey, should we build a new plant? Should we invest in this sector of our business? And that's where you're saying that's going to be more specific, and that's going to really narrow your thinking of what you're going to be looking at, what you're going to be scanning at. And in those cases, then you really have to, and that's where it really starts getting proprietary information, as you talked about. But you'll move your exercises towards those areas of the questions that the futurists that you're going to be asking and you're going to be looking at. And then that also determines what you're going to be scanning for, because you'll be scanning a lot more narrowly at things. And then when you bring people back together, what you do is you start stimulating different scenarios on how that future might be. And there's a number of different methods for that too, on just how to start putting those visions into the future and making them visions of the future, the possible futures, and choosing which are preferable ones is among those. And if it sounds like I'm being evasive on the methodology, it's because it's really, the methodology chosen is very much a situation specific, and very sensitive to what the situation is. So this is one of the things that in some ways makes foresight and futurism more of an art than, say, a science or a technology, is because there's no prescribed formula. You can't say, if we put inputs here, we're definitely going to get these outputs. And it is so situation specific. It's really why an organization needs a futurist if they truly want to look at the future.
Yeah.
Now they've got a lot of that knowledge inside, but that futurist is going to use these methodologies to help pull that out and put it into a format that's usable.
So let's play with that a little bit, Alex. I get it. I mean, there's lots of places that we can adapt scenario planning and strategic foresight and the skills that a futurist brings to the table. But bring that down a little bit tighter. I think you talked about it a little bit. Bring it down a little bit tighter around our lives, in our societies. How does the work that really serious scenario planning, strategic foresight of futures, how does that work? How can it impact us as individuals?
It can impact tremendously, and it's probably impacting you today in ways you're not realizing. Let me talk about, I was actually just recently reviewing a book I'd read before called Transformative Scenario Planning, and the author, Adam, I think Hane is maybe how you pronounce his name. And he ended up, he was at Shell. Shell comes up a lot in any strategic foresight discussion, because they are the ones that have really been, they've had a formal scenario planning department basically since the 60s. And it's how they moved from being one of the middling oil companies to one of the largest oil companies today, energy companies today, is because they've transformed themselves.
I heard that pivot on the word just now too, dude.
Yeah, exactly. and so this person had worked at Shell in the scenario department, and he ended up being included in what became known as the Mount Fleur, once again, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, scenario project in South Africa in 1991. And what this project was about was they were bringing together all the leaders in the South African community, because the year before, de Klerk had announced that apartheid was going away. And society now was going to be reordered. And it could go a number of different ways. And so they brought all these divergent interests into a room, and over the course of a week or so, they put them through their paces, and they began to look at what are the scenarios, how could the future go for South Africa. And they used a little different methodology where they would look at a scenario and say, well, here's a possible scenario based on what everybody in, certain people in the room are talking about. Is that good for us or not? Well, if we reject it, what's the alternative to that? And then they would look at that scenario. And then they would say, well, if we reject that one, what does it look like? Well, then here's another possible. And then they did this until they got to where they called Flight of the Flamingos, is what they called the scenario. And it's the one that they more or less adopted, which was a transformative plan for South Africa, and how they could move from apartheid majority or minority white rule to a new majority black rule, and still maintain the semblance of continuity within the country. Because you got to understand, all countries are subject to outside investment and borrowing and things. So if you radically transform, you could change your country from an economic perspective very, very negatively. And what's interesting is, if I may tell a joke that Adam had related, that he said that a joke that was going around in South Africa at the time said there's only two ways we're going to solve our problems. One is the practical way. And the practical way is that we all get down on our knees and pray to God and pray to God and pray to God until God sends down a band of angels and makes everything happen. Then there's the miraculous way. And the miraculous way is that we all sit down, listen to each other, talk to each other, and plot our own destinies.
Yeah. Doesn't that scenario apply to so much?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And especially when I think there's a tremendous amount of political risk in the US right now. And I think we're going to be finding a situation where we're going to be forced into something like that. I don't make predictions, but I will say I talk about risks and possibilities.
Yeah, I get it.
So you do have a crystal ball hiding under the desk there somewhere, huh? When you pull that, I bet your crystal ball is a higher grade than Teddy's. I'm just, Teddy, you get that at a gumball machine? Where did that come from anyway? I don't know.
I think this is the closest I get.
I love it.
Ball.
And I mean, I get it, Alex. A whole lot of this is, I live and die by the statement behind my head. And I think our future is significantly impacted by that statement. If we're not willing to get into conversations, then our world is going to be different than we would want it to be. It could be different than we want it to be.
Well, and exactly. And it all starts with a conversation. And in our little, before we really went on camera, we were chatting and talking about how small the world is.
Yeah.
And the only way you begin to find out that I've met your cousin, say, is
that's true. Actually, he did.
That is, yeah. And we discussed it because I brought up Boise and
Boise, Idaho.
And your cousin was a police officer there. We started a conversation and found out that I'd met your cousin. But if we don't start those conversations, and if we don't work these issues, we don't begin to realize what the possible solutions are. And for example, with the South African situation, you had people that were very much on far different sides of the positions. And even people like Mandela, who was kind of caught in the middle of all this, because he had one side calling for one thing and he had the other side calling for another thing. And what they had to do is they had to sit down and say, look, if we do it your way, here's that scenario, but how will that work out broadly?
Yeah.
If we do it your way, that'll do that. And that's the format they use there.
Yeah. So let's talk about
the conversation.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. I got a couple more things we want to try to hit on. We want to try to hit on headlines, and what's that mean, and how does futurists look at that? But let's talk about something else. I got two big questions before we get that. Number one is how do organizations employ futurists? You and I talked about this a couple of days ago.
Sure, and the University of Houston has looked at this just recently, trying to get an understanding of how much the penetration of professional futurists is into corporate America. And at best guess, and I say best guess because corporations aren't always forthcoming, because foresight can be a pretty powerful advantage. It can be a competitive advantage if you're truly looking at the future and using professional futures and strategic foresight to do so, and be watching for how these changes might be coming about, and then being able to adjust to them simply because you've already had those conversations. If X happens, we'll do Y. If Z happens, we'll do B or something. those are the conversations that strategic foresight bring up. Yeah, once again, it's not a prediction. Foresight will not tell you X is going to happen, but we'll say if X happens, what would your response be? And then you can start building that into your strategies.
Yeah.
And so that's how it can be a competitive advantage. But the University of Houston looked at this recently, and they estimate about 25% of Fortune 500 companies have professional futurists on staff.
Yeah.
And I know I've been seeing a few more even help wanted ads for professional futurists with organizations, people who are trained in foresight, because it is a different mindset. And it's very much a qualitative kind of line of questioning. As I mentioned, there's no data about the future other than perhaps demographics.
Yeah.
So you have to look at those qualitative things.
Yeah.
And in that then is also where backgrounds in science fiction. I know somebody had popped up with a question about how does science fiction play into it. Science fiction has sometimes been in many times, the only real strategic foresight we have in society. When those people were writing science fiction, when Asimov started and Bradbury and things like that, they were about the only true futurists out there at that point, because they were looking at things saying, oh, well, what if technology does this and we have this? You know, and even H.G. Wells was actually spoke to Parliament, I think, one time, calling for them to create an office of the future in 1906. Once again, a man very much before his time.
Yeah.
So it is becoming a thing where more and more, and you know, futurists are now beginning embedded in American government. In Europe, they're already there.
Yeah.
Many of the EU policies call for strategic foresight studies to be done, not necessarily to always understand how good things might become, but to understand what secondary and tertiary effects might be of policies or of things that could occur. So once again, a lot of it is about, you want to understand how the future might go so that you can take advantage of the possibilities that presents and avoid the risks that it could.
Yeah, I get it. And towards that, Susan asked this question, you know, do you get involved with working with startups when they're doing their forecasting modeling? Does a futurist play a role in there?
I've actually done some work in just kind of general reporting. I look at it as somebody comes and says, hey, I'm thinking about buying this business. Does it have a future? Or I'm thinking about starting this business. Does it have a future? And what I can do for them is I can put together a report for them. I can go look out and do all that scanning and look at all those factors and come back and say, well, this is kind of what's out there right now. And these are some of the things from a futurist perspective that could affect these things. Just, you know, but once again, this is kind of one person's point of view in that report based on my training and my scanning. Yeah. And then, but that's just a simple report.
I get
it. And it can give you an idea of whether there might be a future there.
Yeah. Todd asked if you feel that Leonardo da Vinci was potentially the first futurist.
You know, I think the first futurist was the person who said, hey,
let there be light.
What can we do with this fire thing? That's the thing. Because, and I say that because actually, so Leonardo might have been one of the first. I mean, I think he was more an inventor. But the one thing to remember is we are all futurists. Every one of us is a futurist, because we all wake up in the morning and think about what if we want to do in the future. And, you know, many of us confront that as an adult the first time when we choose what job do we want to have, or do we want to go to college, or because those are all decisions that are impacting the future. Because remember, every decision that you make and you don't make is impacting your future. So if you decide not to go to college, that's going to send you down a different route.
So you're saying back in 1976, when I made a decision not to go to Kansas City, but instead to go to a local carnival where I met my current wife, that was me playing a futurist, making a decision and then reaping reaping the rewards or dealing with the chaos. Right. And I will state publicly it was reaping the rewards.
Hey, I got to ask you. I mean, you know, and you've talked this too. It's not 2 + 2 = 4 every day, and I get that. You plug this in, you get this answer. But so looking at because we are a subjective creature, the sway of social media, of politics. There, in other words, there may be what you determine to be the optimal path. But because humans get in and muck it up, and there's politics involved, and there's social media, and one of our mutual friends, he's a representative with one of our senators, U.S. senators, and one of the things he talks about is terms of why government is broken. Is back in the old days, you didn't have social media and everything else where you could get parties, two guys from different parties together in private and they can work something out. Whereas now everything is out there. And if you don't toe the party line, you're going to get primaried. And so you develop these polar opposites versus back in the day when people could get together because there was some sense of privacy. And you don't see that now. Things are so transparent, so volatile. Do you see that changing at all? And how do we work with it if we say, hey, this is where we are, man? Yeah. But how do we deal with it?
Well, let's bring that up in the headline conversation.
All right. Yeah, let's do that.
Before we get to the headline conversation, Alex, let's talk about
okay.
Let's talk about two examples that I think you have. Yep. One of them has to do with a company that is, I don't even know if they're on the stock market anymore. And another one's about Shell Oil. So yeah. One was smart and one wasn't so smart for different reasons. You want to talk about those two examples?
Sure. So one is Shell Oil, because Shell Oil did, Pierre Wack, who, if I remember correctly, worked for, he was in the government and had worked at Rand Corporation when they were doing all this scenario development and things in the late 50s, early 60s. And he took it to the corporate world and actually went to Shell and helped them in the late 60s, if I remember my history correctly here, set up the ability to look at things and look at different scenarios. And during that, they came up with a scenario. Well, what would happen if all of a sudden there was a shock to the oil supply because all the oil exporting countries had decided to embargo it or something, and that's exactly what OPEC then did a couple of years later. And while a lot of oil companies were caught completely off guard by that, Shell had already gone through these conversations. And they had already, so it wasn't so much that they banked on that happening and prepared it by building facilities and storing oil, but they were at least ready to respond because they had already talked about possibilities of what they would do. So they were quicker to respond. And Shell has continued to do that, which is one of the reasons why they've gone from like number 9 or 10 on the list of oil companies back in the 60s to now one of the like top 3 or 4. Yeah. And another example of people who had a good strategic foresight cast in their hand and ignored it is Kodak. Mm. A lot of people don't realize, but Kodak invented the digital camera. But in the 70s and 80s, their most profitable sector was film, so paper and chemicals. Yeah. And I think anybody who's old enough to remember those Kodak moments, you could snap pictures, but then you always had to take it and get it processed. And sometimes it seemed like the processing was even more expensive than the film. So, those memories were precious. You didn't want to, not like today with your phone camera. But they invented the digital camera about 1976, 77. They got the first patents on it. And the CEO at the time had asked one of their lead engineers, hey, where can we go with this? Where is this going to take us, this new technology? And he went out and actually consulted with some of the futurists at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, which had a foresight program at that time, and some others within the business. And then he comes back and he told the CEO, he goes, all right, so here's the deal. The bad news is digital cameras are going to completely destroy our business model. No more paper and chemicals. But the good news is we've got about probably 10 to 15 years to prepare for it, because there's going to be a lot of other technology that has to catch up before it will probably override it. Now, this is a report that turned out to be extremely almost predictive in its nature, but Kodak ignored it. The CEO was like, yeah, that's cute, but don't tell anybody about that. And then they continued to stress the paper and chemical position throughout the 80s. When they first started making digital cameras, even their first digital camera that they brought out to the public was one where you would take a picture, look at an LCD screen, and if you like it, push another button to print it to film.
Yeah.
So see, they were blinded by their current business model and not wanting to get away from that. So they ignored what strategic foresight was telling them.
Yeah. And there are a lot of other companies that are have made that mistake as well, or similar mistakes as well. I think there's a lot of businesses that we know today. Look, Google it. There's no such thing as an upper knocker anymore. Businesses change all the time, but if you're preparing for it by doing scenario planning and doing, strategic visions of what could happen, then you'll be better off than most companies. All right, headlines.
Yeah, so headlines is, once again, these are not prediction, but how do you get across to people that the future is going to be different? One way is to get them thinking about it. And as we've already talked about, fiction is one of those ways, right? So science fiction has really prepared us for a lot of different changes.
Oh, I thought you meant Facebook just now.
They may be talking about that 20 years from now.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
So some future headlines is one way to think about it, because I think these are plausible, possible headlines. Phoenix declares daytime curfew due to high temperatures. So, and this is one I actually have written and put out on LinkedIn. The New York Stock Exchange closes its doors for lack of stocks. So that's driven by the fact that we actually have less publicly traded companies now than we did 30 years ago, and the rise of private equity. So think about that one. And then you think about these things and go, well, how would that affect me? Yeah. Second Constitutional Convention rewrites and ratifies new constitution.
And by the way, listen to what Alex said. These are not predictions. These are headlines that people are using to influence the way we think.
But just think about how that might, and that could introduce all kinds of political risk.
Yeah.
And this was actually, there's organizations who've been pushing this since the 80s that we do this. New York declares Manhattan a driver-free zone. All vehicles will need to be networked to move through the city.
No drivers going across the bridges anymore.
No. And that's one of the things that's being looked at with driverless cars is ultimately you could network them so all cars would go at a constant speed. It's the drivers that cause accidents more often than not. Yeah.
So Alex,
this is one of the things that can't be predicted is human interaction.
Yeah.
And
this is good stuff.
Why you really need to understand those things.
I hear you, man. Like Randy said, it's the humans that muck it up. So this is good stuff. We could go on for a lot longer, but we're out of time, man. I really appreciate the conversations. You really helped me get a better understanding of what a futurist is, and what scenario planning is, and strategic foresight. So thanks a lot. I really do appreciate it. I am not going to rely on my crystal ball so much more anymore moving forward. Give me one powerful statement that the audience needs to take away from this conversation, Alex.
I think I've already stated it a few times because I think it is so important, but that is every decision we make and every decision we don't make is what influences the future. And we have to think of it in terms of that.
Yeah.
So all our actions, the people that we put in power, and really to make the future better, we need to start having more conversations about it. Yeah. And better conversations, because the decisions you make without information are always your worst decisions.
Yeah, good point.
Good. Thanks,
good
Alex.
Yep. Yeah, Alex, good stuff. Randy, what do you think, man?
Real quick story, and this is something, Teddy, you had mentioned in one of your LinkedIn posts, I think, a while back, and that's this, talking about planning in the future. As a worker, what happens if your industry dies overnight or your business goes out of business? What's your next plan? Where do you go from there? And so I can kind of weave the job search piece into what you're talking about in terms of companies. But again, good stuff. And I think the idea here is not to get caught off guard totally. To look at the info and make the best decisions. In fact, I wrote a column in the Sunday paper on the 17th called Hit the Putt. Hit the putt. And whether it's resume, job hunt, business, you know what? It's never going to be perfect, guys. Never going to be perfect. You make the best choice based on the information. And you know what? If you miss the putt, Alex, you hit it again.
And Randy, I've got my strategic planning in place in that context. If my career or my industry goes away, Alex, do you have an extra bedroom? Good. I've got it planned. Hey, Randy, who's our speaker next week?
Next week, Jason Butler joins us on the 27th. Jason is going to talk about the importance of belonging. And so what does that mean? From a retention standpoint, I mean, companies are having a hard time finding and retaining people. And it's one thing to offer more money and this and that and the, but if you can develop a sense of belonging, an atmosphere where your employees feel like they belong there, and he'll dissect that. What does that mean? How can we implement that kind of stuff? But that'll be next week. Jason Butler joins us on the 27th for our 120th episode. Is that right? You getting there, man?
Yep, good stuff.
Sounds good. Alex, hey, guys, again, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Alex.
Our Elder Law Firm is one of our sponsors. If you want to have a conversation with someone about your future and about strategic planning for your future, or for those you care about, reach out to the Elder Law Firm in Greensboro, North Carolina. Alex, Randy, take care, gentlemen.
Thank you, now. Have a good day.
Bye.